My name is Nathan Brooks. I'm 52 years old, and I own a small marina on the coast of Maine where fishing boats, sailing yachts, and weathered wooden docks have been part of my life for as long as I can remember. The marina isn't glamorous. Salt clings to every railing, the wind never seems to stop, and every morning begins with gulls screaming before the sun has fully climbed over the Atlantic. My grandfather built the first dock with his own hands after returning from the Navy. My father expanded it into a real business, and when he passed away, everything became my responsibility. Over the years I modernized what I could, installing computerized fuel pumps, online booking systems for seasonal slips, security cameras, and weather monitoring software that warns boat owners before storms roll in. But no amount of technology changes the fact that ropes still have to be tied by hand, engines still refuse to start on freezing mornings, and the ocean always reminds you that it answers to no one. For 26 years I shared every sunrise with my wife, Claire. She handled reservations, organized the office, remembered every customer's birthday, and somehow managed to make even the busiest summer weekends feel calm. 5 years ago, a sudden heart condition took her away before either of us believed it could. There was no long goodbye, no chance to prepare, only a phone call from the hospital that divided my life into a before and an after. The morning following her funeral, I unlocked the marina at exactly 5:30 because I couldn't imagine doing anything else. I convinced myself that if every routine stayed untouched, maybe the silence at home wouldn't seem so permanent. It never worked. Her reading glasses remained on the office bookshelf for years. The blue sweater she always kept hanging behind the office door stayed exactly where she left it. I couldn't bring myself to move either of them. People around town were kind in the way small towns usually are. They dropped off casseroles, shook my hand, promised to check in, then slowly returned to their own lives while I stayed trapped inside mine. The only person who never seemed to disappear was Emma Carter, the 28-year-old owner of the little bookstore and coffee shop across the harbor road. I'd watched Emma grow up from a quiet teenager who spent afternoons sketching boats in a notebook into a confident business owner who somehow made reading feel fashionable again in a town where most people talked about tides instead of novels. She had bought the abandoned corner building, restored it herself, and turned it into the busiest gathering place in town. Every Thursday morning she crossed the street carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. She always claimed one had been made by mistake and would go to waste if I didn't drink it. I knew perfectly well there had never been a mistake. Still, I accepted it every single time. Some mornings we talked about incoming storms, local gossip, or the tourists who insisted on feeding seagulls despite every warning sign. Other mornings we simply stood at the end of the dock watching the waves roll beneath us without saying much at all. She had a rare talent for making silence feel peaceful instead of lonely. I told myself she was only being kind to an older widower everyone worried about. It was the safest explanation, and for years I never questioned it. Then one cold October morning, while we watched the sunrise paint the harbor gold, I laughed at something she said and joked, "If life had given me another 20 years, I might have been brave enough to ask someone like you out." I expected her to laugh, tease me for being ridiculous, and sip her coffee like always. Instead, she slowly lowered her cup, looked directly into my eyes with a calm expression that stole every word from my mouth, and quietly said, "Nathan, 20 years wouldn't have changed my answer." Nathan, 20 years wouldn't have changed my answer. Her words settled over the dock more heavily than the morning fog drifting across the harbor. For several seconds I honestly wondered if I had misunderstood her. The gulls continued circling overhead, a fishing boat rumbled out toward open water, and somewhere behind us a truck unloaded fresh lobster traps, but every familiar sound suddenly felt distant. "What do you mean?" I finally asked, my voice quieter than I intended. Emma studied me for a moment, almost as if she were deciding whether I was ready to hear the truth. Then she offered the smallest smile, one that carried more sadness than amusement. "You already know what I mean." Before I could answer, her phone vibrated. She glanced at the screen, slipped it back into her coat pocket, and gave a soft sigh. "I have to open the cafe. The morning crowd will be there in 10 minutes. She turned and walked away, leaving me standing at the end of the dock with 2 untouched coffee cups growing cold beside us. I watched her cross the harbor road until she disappeared inside the bookstore, and for the rest of the day I couldn't focus on anything that normally came as naturally as breathing. I forgot a fuel order, nearly overfilled a customer's tank, and had to ask my mechanic twice which engine he had just repaired because I hadn't heard a word he'd said. That evening I locked the marina later than usual and sat alone in the office staring at Claire's old sweater hanging behind the door. I remembered something she'd once told me after catching me overthinking whether we could afford to expand the marina years earlier. "Nathan," she'd laughed, "you can spend your whole life calculating every possible risk until the opportunity disappears on its own." Back then I had smiled and ignored her advice. Now those words returned with uncomfortable clarity. Over the next several days I started noticing things I had somehow convinced myself not to see before. Emma always remembered exactly how I liked my coffee without asking. She knew which mornings I skipped breakfast and quietly left a warm muffin beside my cup. Whenever storms were forecast, she texted before sunrise to remind me to secure the outer docks, even though she knew I would already be doing it. Last winter, when I slipped on the icy pier and bruised my shoulder, she had closed her own shop for 2 hours just to drive me to the clinic, insisting she had nowhere more important to be. At the time I had thanked her for being a thoughtful neighbor. Looking back now, I realize no one shows that kind of consistency for years without deeper feelings. The realization frightened me more than it comforted me. I was 52. She was 28. There were 24 years between us, enough for strangers to whisper and enough for me to question every emotion I had buried since Claire's death. Emma deserved someone her own age, someone who could give her decades I wasn't sure I had left. The whole town seemed to agree without ever saying it directly. One afternoon I stopped by the hardware store for dock supplies and overheard 2 customers talking about Emma having dinner with Ryan Mitchell, a 31-year-old architect who had recently moved back from Boston to renovate historic homes along the coast. They laughed that it was about time the prettiest woman in town stopped spending all her free mornings at the marina. I pretended to compare boxes of screws while every word landed harder than it should have. Ryan sounded perfect on paper: successful, charming, close to her age, educated, and respected by everyone who met him. As I drove back toward the water that afternoon, I kept repeating the same sentence to myself. If she chose someone like Ryan, no one would question it. No one would stare. No one would think she'd sacrificed her future. By the time I reached the marina, I had almost convinced myself that letting her go would be the kindest thing I could ever do, even if the thought left a weight in my chest I hadn't felt since the day I buried Claire. The following Thursday arrived with gray skies and a steady drizzle that usually kept customers away until late morning, but I still found myself glancing toward the harbor road every few minutes without admitting why. At exactly 8 o'clock Emma crossed the street holding the familiar cardboard tray with 2 coffees, though this time her smile was softer, more cautious, as if she were unsure whether she was still welcome. She placed 1 cup beside me and rested her hands in the pockets of her coat. "Busy morning?" she asked. "Not yet," I answered. An awkward silence settled between us, nothing like the comfortable quiet we had always shared. I cleared my throat. "I heard Ryan Mitchell has been spending time at your cafe." She looked at me carefully before replying. "People around here notice everything." "Is it true?" She nodded once. "He invited me to dinner." I forced myself to smile. "He's a good man." Her expression didn't change. "I'm sure he is. Successful too. Around your age." She lowered her eyes for a second before looking back at me. "Nathan, are you recommending him to me?" My stomach tightened. "I'm just saying you deserve someone who can give you the future you should have." She let out a slow breath that carried disappointment more than anger. "You're doing it again." "Doing what?" "Making decisions for my life without asking what I actually want." I looked toward the water because I couldn't bear the hurt beginning to show in her face. "Emma, people would talk." She gave a quiet laugh with no humor in it. "People already talk. They'd judge you." "Maybe. But they'd be judging my choice, not yours." I shook my head. "You're 28. You could build an entire lifetime with someone your own age." She stepped a little closer, her voice calm but unwavering. "Do you know why I started bringing you coffee every Thursday?" I didn't answer. "Because 5 years ago, after Claire passed away, I watched you unlock this marina every morning with the same empty look on your face. Everyone else offered sympathy for a week. Then they moved on. I couldn't. My throat tightened. She continued before I could interrupt. Do you know why I learned about tides, engines, and weather reports? Why I memorized your schedule? Why I always knew when you skipped lunch? I slowly shook my head. Because I cared about you long before I understood what those feelings meant. My heart pounded so loudly I barely heard the rain hitting the dock. Emma. She raised a hand gently, stopping me. No. Please let me finish this once. I nodded. I didn't fall in love with an imaginary younger version of you, she said. I fell in love with the man who stayed beside his wife until her final heartbeat. The man who quietly paid a struggling fisherman's repair bill without telling anyone. The man who spends every Christmas delivering free fuel to the Coast Guard because he says someone has to look after the people who protect everyone else. Those aren't things age changes. I felt every carefully built wall inside me begin to crack. You don't understand what you're asking for, I whispered. I understand exactly what I'm asking for. One day you'll wake up beside an old man while you're still young. That's my decision to make. You might regret it. She smiled sadly. You're afraid I'll regret loving you more than you're afraid of living without me. I had no answer because she was right. She reached for her coffee, now almost cold, and wrapped both hands around the cup. I'm not asking you to promise me forever, she said quietly. No one gets that. I'm only asking you to stop pretending your fear is protecting me. She looked into my eyes one last time before stepping backward toward the road. Ryan asked me to attend the Harbor Lights Gala with him next Saturday. I haven't answered yet. My chest tightened. She gave me one final, heartbreaking smile. If you truly believe he's the man I should choose, I'll respect that. But at least be honest with yourself about why you're saying it. Then she turned and walked back toward her bookstore, leaving me alone on the rain-soaked dock, staring at the empty coffee cup in my hand and wondering if I had just watched the woman I loved walk away because I was too afraid to admit the truth. I barely slept after Emma left the marina that rainy morning. Her words echoed through every quiet corner of the house, following me from room to room until even the ticking of the old hallway clock sounded like it was asking the same question: what are you really afraid of? By Saturday evening, the Harbor Lights Gala had become the only thing anyone in town seemed to be talking about. Every storefront displayed strings of white lights, the waterfront restaurants were fully booked, and boats decorated with lanterns drifted across the harbor for the annual celebration. I told myself I had no reason to attend. Crowds had never interested me, and formal events had always been Claire's favorite, not mine. Instead, I stayed at the marina finishing paperwork that could easily have waited until Monday. Around 8 o'clock I walked outside and looked toward the harbor where music floated across the water. From the dock I could just make out the glow of the festival across the bay, and despite the distance I couldn't stop imagining Emma there beside Ryan, laughing the way she laughed whenever she forgot the rest of the world existed. I hated myself for feeling jealous when I had practically pushed her toward him. Around 9:30 the headlights of a familiar blue SUV turned into the marina parking lot. My heart skipped before I even recognized the driver. Emma stepped out wearing a navy blue dress beneath a cream-colored coat, her hair falling over her shoulders instead of being tied back the way I had seen it almost every Thursday for years. For a moment I simply stared because I had never seen her look so effortlessly beautiful. She walked toward me with slow, uncertain steps. I hope I'm not interrupting, she said. You never interrupt. She glanced toward the harbor lights before looking back at me. I left the gala early. I swallowed. Where's Ryan? He drove me back to my bookstore. I walked here. We stood facing each other while the waves tapped gently against the wooden pilings beneath us. Finally, I asked the question I had been dreading all evening. Did he ask you to be with him? She nodded once. He did. My chest tightened. And? I told him no. Relief washed over me so suddenly that I almost felt guilty for it. Why? She looked at me with a mixture of exhaustion and tenderness. Nathan. How many different ways do I have to answer that question? I looked away toward the dark water.
Ryan seems like the kind of man who could make you happy. Maybe he could, she admitted softly. But he isn't the man I love. Silence stretched between us.
Finally, I whispered, Claire was the love of my life.
Emma nodded without hesitation. I know she was.
Part of me still feels like loving someone else means I'm leaving her behind. Emma stepped closer but stopped just within arm's reach, respecting the distance I hadn't yet found the courage to cross. Loving me doesn't erase your life with Claire, she said.
It honors the man she helped you become.
I closed my eyes, remembering the last conversation Claire and I had shared in her hospital room. She had smiled through her pain and squeezed my hand.
Promise me you won't confuse surviving with living. At the time I thought she was asking me to keep the marina running.
Standing there with Emma, I finally understood she had been asking something much harder. Tears burned behind my eyes for the first time in years.
I'm terrified, I admitted. Not because I don't love you, but because I do. Emma's eyes filled as well, though she smiled through them.
Then stop fighting the part of your heart that's already made its choice. I reached for her hand instinctively, but before our fingers touched, I hesitated.
She noticed. The smile faded into quiet understanding. You still aren't ready, she whispered.
She gently stepped back, her voice steady despite the hurt she couldn't completely hide. I can't keep waiting outside a door you're afraid to open.
Then she turned and slowly walked back toward the parking lot. This time I didn't call after her.
I simply watched until her taillights disappeared into the night, realizing that if I didn't find the courage to face my own fears soon, I wasn't protecting the woman I loved, I was losing her forever. For the next 2 weeks, Thursday mornings became the hardest part of my life. The marina still opened at 5:30, the fishing boats still drifted out before dawn, and the tide still rose and fell with perfect indifference, but the paper cup that had quietly appeared beside me every week for years never came again. I caught myself looking toward the harbor road every few minutes before remembering there was no reason to expect Emma to walk across it anymore. We exchanged brief messages whenever the bookstore needed information about local sailing tours or customers asked about harbor maps I sold in the marina office, but every conversation stayed strictly professional. There were no jokes, no quiet conversations on the dock, and no comfortable silences. It felt as though someone had lowered the volume on the entire world. One rainy afternoon I wandered into the marina office searching for an old maintenance file and accidentally opened the bottom drawer of Claire's desk, something I hadn't done since the week after her funeral.
Inside were neatly organized folders, faded photographs, and a small envelope with my name written across the front in her unmistakable handwriting. My hands began trembling before I even opened it. The letter had no date.
It was only a single page, folded twice. Nathan, it began, if you're reading this, then life kept moving after mine stopped, exactly the way I hoped it would.
I know you better than anyone.
You're probably trying to carry me forever because you think that's what love looks like.
But love was never meant to become an anchor.
If someone walks into your life one day and makes you laugh again, don't push her away because of me. The years we shared will never disappear simply because your heart learns to make room for someone else.
Promise me you'll remember that guilt is not the same thing as loyalty.
I read those words 3 times before the tears finally came. For 5 years I had convinced myself I was honoring Claire by refusing to let anyone else get close. In reality, I had been ignoring the very future she wanted for me. I looked around the office and suddenly noticed how frozen everything had remained. Her sweater still hung behind the door exactly where she had left it. The faded calendar still showed the month she died. Even the flowers pressed inside an old notebook had never been moved.
That afternoon I opened every window despite the cold sea air.
I carefully folded the sweater and placed it inside a cedar chest instead of leaving it on display like a shrine. I framed one of our happiest photographs and placed it on the bookshelf instead of hiding dozens of painful reminders in every corner.
I wasn't erasing Claire.
I was finally allowing my memories to become part of my life instead of my prison.
The following morning I walked across the harbor toward Emma's bookstore before I had time to talk myself out of it.
Through the front window I saw her arranging new releases on a display table while soft jazz played in the background. When the bell above the door rang, she looked up with obvious surprise. For a second neither of us spoke.
Then she quietly asked, "What brings you here?" I took a slow breath. The truth. She set the book in her hands aside and waited. "I spent years telling myself I was protecting you," I said. "But I finally realized I was only protecting myself from being hurt again." Her eyes never left mine. "I'm still afraid," I admitted. "I'm afraid people will judge you. I'm afraid I won't have enough years with you. I'm afraid I'll lose you someday the way I lost Claire." My voice cracked. "But I'm even more afraid of spending the rest of my life wondering what would have happened if I'd been brave enough to love you honestly." Emma's expression softened, though she still said nothing. I stepped closer. "If you're willing, I'd like to stop hiding behind fear and start getting to know you not as the woman who brought me coffee every Thursday, but as the woman I love." A tear slipped down her cheek as the first genuine smile I'd seen in weeks slowly returned to her face. Emma didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked around the counter until she stood only a few inches away from me, searching my face as though she wanted to be absolutely certain this wasn't another moment of hesitation that would disappear with the tide. "Are you saying this because you don't want to lose me?" she asked softly, "or because you truly want a future with me?" I smiled through damp eyes. "Both. But if I had to choose only one answer, I'd choose the second." She let out a shaky laugh before gently taking my hand. "Do you realize," she whispered, "that I've been waiting almost 5 years to hear those words?" I nodded. "I know, and I'm sorry I made you wait so long." She squeezed my hand. "Then don't waste any more time." That afternoon we closed the bookstore early and drove north along the coastline until we found a quiet seafood restaurant overlooking the ocean, far enough away that no one from town would recognize us. It wasn't a grand first date. We spent half the evening laughing about things we had never admitted before: how she intentionally burned the first batch of blueberry muffins she ever baked for me because she was so nervous, how I had pretended not to notice every Thursday just to spare her embarrassment, and how both of us had spent years convincing ourselves the other couldn't possibly feel the same way. For the first time since Claire's passing, laughter didn't feel like betrayal. It felt like healing. When we stepped outside after dinner, the wind coming off the Atlantic was cold enough to make Emma wrap both hands around her coat. Without thinking, I slipped my jacket over her shoulders. She looked up at me with that same steady gaze that had first unsettled my heart on the marina dock. "You know," she said with a teasing smile, "you're still going to worry too much." I laughed. "Probably. And I'll probably spend the rest of my life reminding you that I can make my own decisions." "I hope you do." She reached for my hand, and this time I didn't hesitate. I intertwined my fingers with hers as naturally as if they had always belonged there. A week later we returned to town together. As expected, people noticed. Some smiled warmly. Others whispered. A few questioned our age difference openly, but Emma answered every comment with quiet confidence. "I'm nearly 30, she calmly told one curious customer. "I own my business, pay my own bills, and choose the people I love for myself." After hearing that, most conversations ended before they became arguments. Even Ryan approached us one afternoon outside the bookstore. He shook my hand, wished us both happiness, and admitted that while he had hoped Emma might choose him, he respected her decision. His grace earned my respect in return. Months passed, and our relationship settled into something wonderfully ordinary. Thursday mornings didn't disappear, they simply changed. Instead of Emma bringing coffee to the marina alone, we opened the cafe together before sunrise, carried 2 steaming cups across the harbor, and watched the fishing boats leave while planning both our businesses side by side. She expanded the bookstore into a community art space, while I renovated the marina's aging docks. Before making any major decision, we talked through it as partners instead of rescuing one another. The following autumn, on the very dock where everything had truly begun, I invited Emma to watch the sunrise before the town woke. Resting on the wooden bench between us was a small box beside 2 familiar paper coffee cups. She smiled the moment she saw it. "You're finally done overthinking," she teased. "Not completely," I admitted, making her laugh. I opened the box to reveal a simple engagement ring. 5 years ago, you crossed this harbor with a cup of coffee because you refused to let me face grief alone. You never asked me to forget my past.
You only ask me to stop being afraid of my future. I took a steady breath. Emma Carter, will you spend whatever years life gives us walking beside me? Tears filled her eyes before she even nodded. I was hoping you'd finally ask. I slipped the ring onto her finger, and she wrapped her arms around me as the first sunlight spilled across the harbor. Looking out over the calm water, I smiled and quietly repeated the joke that had started everything. If only I were 20 years younger. Emma rested her forehead against mine and smiled the same beautiful smile that had changed my life forever. Nathan, she whispered, I never wanted a younger man. I only ever wanted you. Together we picked up our coffee cups and walked slowly down the dock toward home, knowing the years behind us had shaped us, but the years ahead, however many there might be, finally belonged to us both.